I'm Ryan Mauro from the Clarion Project. As you probably know, the topic for today's webinar is basically all about Antifa and whether they qualify as a terrorist organization, both the dictionary definition and also legally, and what options exist for us to confront them, because especially ever since President Trump called for basically banning them as a terrorist group, there's a lot of people that seem to think it's just as easy as adding them to a list and then they're gone. But the reality is much more nuanced than that. Things aren't always so easy. So we're going to dive into that topic. But first, on behalf of the Clarion Project, I want to thank our partners at the CELL, C-E-L-L, the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, for helping to make this program possible. And a special thank you to Mr. Larry Mizell and his leadership and his generous support for all of this type of work. You can visit them at thecell.org. We really appreciate their support, which made this webinar possible. So to discuss this issue of Antifa and what can possibly be done about them, we've really got one of the best fits for that topic, Andrew McCarthy, a man I've known for quite a number of years now, and he is a former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in New York, which basically the best thing that he is known for is leading the prosecution of the blind Sheikh. That was essentially a super terrorist in New York who was responsible for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and various other terror plots in the New York area. And so Mr. McCarthy successfully prosecuted him, as well as 11 other jihadists who were part of this terrorist war. After 9/11, he became an advisor to a whole bunch of different politicians, policymakers, different agencies, and he also became an advisor to the Deputy Secretary of Defense and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. And he has a whole bunch of New York Times best-selling books. The list is too long, so I'll just mention a couple of them. Willful Blindness, The Grand Jihad, Spring Fever, and there's a new one, and the title I forget, but Andy, feel free to plug that once we get going. And also, a little known fact, he was also my favorite candidate to become the next Attorney General of the United States, but that didn't happen because things I want to actually have happen tend not to happen. So unfortunately, Andrew McCarthy is not the Attorney General of the United States. He is here with us to discuss this topic of Antifa and to give you a summary and a briefing about the topic that goes beneath the surface and extends further than the typical 3-minute cable news segment that we've all grown used to, and many of us tend to detest at this point. So Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Ryan, I'm really honored to be here. I'm a big admirer of Clarion and of yours in particular. You're doing God's work. I'm really delighted you never got me to be Attorney General because we have a really good Attorney General now. So I'm content to continue to stay one step ahead of indictment.
Right. All right, so let's dive right into the topic, all right? So the first question to begin pretty much any conversation about Antifa nowadays is basically, what is Antifa and are they a terrorist group? And I'll add one thing to it. Are they even a group? Because there's some people that are saying that it's basically just a mirage.
Yeah, well, you know, it's funny the way that all this goes these days is people decide what outcome they want, and then they reason backwards from that, right? So people who don't want us to be heavy-handed in their view with Antifa start from what I think is the ridiculous premise that they don't even actually exist. So, you know, for example, the other night they were, at least there were Antifa elements out when Portland was being torched. So you had this real live fire coming from people who don't exist, which is pretty interesting. The legal definition for whether something exists that you can actually, you know, sort of not only wrap your brain around, but prosecute as an entity is really centered around the idea of violating the law. So you have some criminal organizations that almost have the regiment of the military, like take a mafia family. They are very organized. They have, you know, different levels of hierarchy. They have titles that they formally give. They have an induction ceremony and all that kind of jazz. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are loosely confederated around an agreement to violate some law, whether it's a state law or a federal law. And those groups do not have to have the organization and regiment of the military in order to be defined as groups under the law. In fact, probably the best definition, Ryan, of this is in the federal racketeering laws. We look to those because a traditional conspiracy is something that is an organization or a group that is basically built around the idea of violating one law. That's because all a conspiracy is an agreement to violate the law, whether it's, bank robbery or narcotics trafficking or what have you. Enterprises or racketeering enterprises under the law are looser arrangements because the crime in racketeering is to be a member of an organization that commits a whole bunch of disparate crimes, so that they may commit 12 different offenses and no one or two or no more than one or two of them may be involved in any one venture, but the crime is actually being associated with the group. And what federal law tells us about that is that any enterprise in fact or association in fact can be a racketeering enterprise, which is a very broad definition that can take in anything from something that's really, really loosely organized. And I think actually Antifa is more organized than what you would find on the bottom rung, versus not only organizations like the mafia that are very regimented, but RICO can even be used against legitimate organizations and corporations or guilds or labor unions or political parties and what have you. So the law doesn't really get itself too hung up on how organized a group has to be in order to be a group. It's really, are they organized around a purpose to violate the law? And if you have that, you have something you can work with in terms of regarding something as criminal. And I know we're going to get to designation, but I think with designation, which we can talk about as a formal process, the most important thing with terrorists is whether you're thinking about you're designating them, you're labeling them, you're branding them, whatever you want to call it. The important thing as we try to attack them by investigation and prosecution is to make up your mind at the beginning that that's what they are, so that you have a kind of a discipline that you can organize your investigation around. So if you're grappling around, what are they? Do they exist? Are they a group? That's not a very efficient way to go about it. And that's probably a lot of the problem we have right now.
So one of the founding principles of Antifa, one of the problems is that there's no central nonprofit or centralized leadership. So people say it's just essentially a brand name. But if you look at their thought leaders, the texts that they pass around, it's very clear that a founding principle is to violate the law. There's actually nowhere in there where they say completely obey the law in any of the Antifa or Antifa type texts that are out there. And I know that some people who belong to Antifa, who identify as Antifa, are also members of other groups that are anarchists, and then they kind of adopt the Antifa label here and there. And so what you're saying is that they don't have to be a formal organization as the common person would think of it, a nonprofit, a leadership structure. Just the fact that they're all associating community, they're a bit of a social network around an idea that includes breaking the law as the centerpiece of that idea, that's enough for them to exist in the mind of the law, and potentially enough to just prosecute someone for being in that social network?
Yeah, well, I think that you really hit the nail on the head when you talk about ideology. And that's something that Clarion's always been very strong on and very clear on, whether we were talking about, the Muslim Brotherhood or the other jihadist groups that we were dealing with in the 80s, the 90s, and going forward. I really think that's important because if you want to educate America about who Antifa is, you should start with what they believe in, what their actual ideology is, and then you can work out to how they plan to actuate it and what their schemes are and all that stuff. But to really understand the essence of something, you have to understand what they believe. And I think probably my prosecution, our prosecution of the blind sheikh back in the 90s is a good example of this, because it seems long ago and far away now. But back then in 90, 91, 93 was when the Trade Center was bombed. There was no Al-Qaeda as we know it. I mean, we now know from the history of Al-Qaeda that it formed in Afghanistan in the 80s. But, for those of us who followed this closely, what it was in, the middle of the 1980s is different from what it was in the end of the 80s, and what it was in 93 is different from what it was in 98. So it evolved over time. And it existed at the time that the blind sheikh had his terrorist cell in the New York, New Jersey area. But the people who were attached to that were not, that cell didn't really have a formal name or title. The blind sheikh ran an Egyptian terrorist organization called Jamaat al-Islamiyah. A number of people who were involved in his cell were loosely attached to that organization. There were Hamas guys in the organization. There were Sudanese jihadists in the organization. And the way that we ended up defining them in the indictment was basically to describe them as a New York, New Jersey jihadist cell that was organized around the ideology of the blind sheikh. So for our purposes, the ideology was the key. And it was actually what enabled us, even though we didn't have terrorism charges of the strength of the terrorism charges that we have now because of the overhaul of terrorism law in 1996. Back in 1993, we had to deal with the criminal code as it was. And it turned out that we had a statute that was exactly on point for what these guys were doing. And I would suggest it's also a statute that's on point for what Antifa is doing, which is the seditious conspiracy law, which makes it a crime to conspire to make war against the United States or to oppose the government by force, which seems to me to be pretty dead on with what they're doing. And the reason that charge worked so well for us, and I think can work well again with a group like this, is we organized the charge around what our evidence was, and we derived our evidence from the blind sheikh's ideology, which he was only too happy to share with everyone. So it was interesting because there were two World Trade Center bombing-based prosecutions around the same time. One was against the guys who did the bombing, and it had almost no oral evidence. There was almost, there were no transcripts, there were no wiretaps, there's none of that stuff. It was almost entirely a forensic case. And then when we did the blind sheikh case, which the objective was to try to go back in time and understand where this all came from, what their objectives were, and what else they did besides the Trade Center bombing, which included another plot in New York. We had almost the exact opposite kind of a case. We didn't have much of a forensic case, but it was like the total rock and roll, in your face, here's what we believe case. And I think that made it much easier to build a case around a law that was infrequently invoked because people don't happily make war on the United States that often. But our evidence fully fit that charge, and it was because we concentrated on their ideology.
So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that in that case, but more broadly, potentially including Antifa, there's essentially two components. There's the ideology in order to prove the conspiracy and the broader network, but
Right.
then also the actual criminal act, not just the idea, right? Because you have to show that they're actually going to do something, because otherwise it brings to mind for me a group like Nation of Islam that, has these horrible ideas and would certainly meet the standards of having a conspiracy for that ideology. But then proving that they're acting on that ideology is a whole nother battle. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, you are, because you're hitting on something that's always an interesting dynamic in the criminal law, which is the difference between what the law requires in theory and what is practically necessary in order to make a case. So for example, in theory, the crime in a conspiracy case is the agreement. And in federal law, at least, now state laws can vary, but in federal law, unless the statute expressly says that you need to prove an act in furtherance of the conspiracy, you don't have to prove one. In other words, the intellectual agreement between two people to violate the law is the crime. Now, that sounds fine on a law school exam, but if you're a prosecutor who has to prove a case to a jury, you are never going to be able to prove the agreement unless you show that people acted on it. That's the only way that you actually are able to, prove your evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. So, I always think that the best way to do these things is to build from the agreement out. So you have to wrap your brain around, in the first instance, what is it that they're trying to accomplish? Because if you nail that, then everything they do and everything they say, a lot of which turns out to be subterfuge and coded and furtive and all that stuff, it all makes sense once you understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish. But that's what you have to start with.
Now, there's some people who are like, ignorant college kids who just think Antifa is like a fashionable thing. They don't know much about it. And they'll say, Antifa? I'm Antifa because I'm anti-fascist. And I'm surprised that I'm coming across people in their 30s that are saying this, and they say it self-righteously as if they know something that folks like us don't. So is there any risk then of those who just, kind of in a relaxed way say, hey, I support Antifa, then because of their free speech getting wrapped up in a criminal case if they're not actually conspiring to violate a law? Like, how do you straddle that balance?
Well, the first thing I think you have to instruct people is that the groups that we're talking about are exquisite at using language in an Orwellian way, because they, one of the reasons that Sharia supremacists, which I think is the best description of the fundamentalist Islam that we have to deal with, one of the reasons that they're so successful is that they are very shrewd about wrapping themselves into American civil rights concepts. And for example, like CARE, projecting itself rather than as an arm of Hamas, they project themselves as an Islamic, not even an Islamic, just a civil rights organization that happens to be, obsessively interested in cases involving Muslims. But they want to be perceived by the media and by the academy as a civil rights organization. And even though they are actually promoting an ideology that would undermine all of our civil rights, when they're out trying to do their thing and promote their cause, they wrap themselves in the very thing that they're trying to destroy. There was probably few documents in modern history that were more wrapped up in the idea of civil rights and democracy and freedom than the Soviet Constitution, right? But we know the story there as well. So it's a fairly common thing to be the opposite of what you label yourself in order to advance your cause. The bad thing about that is that you take in a lot of uninformed people who don't seem to have the energy or the interest of informing themselves. The good thing about it is when you pretend to be something that you're not, especially if you're in a jury trial situation, once the jury realizes that you're actually a fascist and you're calling yourself an anti-fascist, that actually becomes pretty good evidence in the courtroom. But of course, you got to get to the courtroom.
Right. And one of the other hypocrisies that I see, and actually it comes from people who are a little bit friendly towards Antifa and those who are not, is that they're sometimes characterized as left-wingers with improper activism. They're
Right.
left-wingers who have been driven by the insanity of the Trump administration and the aggression of the right wing into engaging in violence because they feel that they're not otherwise heard about their left-wing ideas. And we monitor at the Clarion Project a lot of these accounts and individuals who are linked to all sorts of ideologies, but obviously including Antifa. And I was just looking at some yesterday, and one of the things I noticed is that these aren't left-wingers. Like, they hate Joe Biden. They hate Barack Obama.
Right.
Just sort of like how white supremacists, most of them hate Donald Trump, but somehow they all get lumped together.
Right.
So it's interesting to me to see how different political forces characterize Antifa in different ways, and it's all just working out so well for them.
Yeah.
So it's important that we do study the ideologies so that we can clarify exactly what they are, and so that ignorant people don't do things like donate to them without realizing what they are. Oh, they're anti-fascist, cut them a check, or support them in some other way. So I think it's a very important discussion. But let's get to like the key question here about President Trump and what he was saying on Twitter about just banning them as a terrorist group. Is there a list of domestic terrorist organizations? Does that actually exist? Is it possible to designate Antifa as a terrorist group as things stand right now and just get rid of them?
The reason that we have a designation process with the list that generates in connection with foreign terrorist organizations is not really applicable to domestic terrorist organizations. And when I hear President Trump say he'd like to see Antifa get designated, I take that in part that he's not really a lawyer and he doesn't grasp the distinction of why we have a formal legal designation process. And part of it is just common sense that goes to the first thing we discussed, which is you have to make up your mind at the outset that they're a terrorist organization in order to investigate them effectively. You know, you have to decide who is it that you're dealing with. What you were just describing a moment ago about the kind of blending of extremist ideology and, you know, whether people are involved in acts that violate the law or not, which is what we're dealing with Antifa. I always like to say with stuff like this that there's nothing new under the sun, right? Because this is very, very similar to what went on in the late 60s and the 70s with the Weather Underground and with a number of the other terrorist organizations. That's a history, unfortunately, that is forgotten to a lot of people. I look back at, there's a great book that a guy named Brian Burroughs wrote called Days of Rage, which is about the domestic terrorism in the United States from the late 60s to the early 80s. And he points out, just to throw one fact out that made me drop my jaw for a second, in 1972, there were 1,900 bombings in the United States. Now, none of them were the World Trade Center bombing, right? None of them was 9/11. But that just gives you a sort of a sense of what the scale of, you know, crazy that we were dealing with at that period of time in the country, and the terrorist organizations that were behind it, which were a bunch of different splinter groups. Now, here was the big problem, and this is the reason why the law draws this distinction between the domestic and the international or the foreign. When you're dealing with domestic terrorists, you're dealing with Americans who have the full array of constitutional rights. And what invariably happens with terrorism is that violent activity is inextricably bound up with constitutionally protected activity like free assembly, free speech, and the like. And what you had happen in the 60s, which is why you had all these spying scandals, one of which, by the way, ended up creating the FISA court. That was the rationale for the FISA court, was a lot of what went on in the 60s and 70s. But there were a lot of instances, at least I think this is more now by way of lore than reality, because in reality, I think they were mostly targeted on dangerous people who were actually terrorists. But there were people who were investigated who didn't do anything other than dissent against the war in Vietnam or other injustice that they perceived in the country. And the scandal was that the government was using the laws that we have and the tools that we have for investigating, conducting counterintelligence activities, protecting the country from terrorists. They were using that to spy on people who weren't doing anything in violation of the law. And in that sense, their constitutional rights were being violated. On the other side of the fence, you have international terrorism. And the problem with dealing with an outfit like Al-Qaeda, say, or any of the, Al-Qaeda is probably as good an example as any. You know, if you think about it, they're plotting attacks against the United States from places outside the United States. They have safe havens in areas where the writ of our courts doesn't run, where our law enforcement and intelligence agencies can't operate, and where American law doesn't apply. So the designation process was an effort by Congress to extend some American jurisdiction over the activity of international actors so that we can do things like stop and freeze their bank accounts, stop their financial transactions, dry up their ability to recruit and to raise money and the like. That's the reason we have a designation process for foreign and international terrorists. We don't have it with domestic terrorists, but that's not because we care less about domestic terrorism. Obviously, domestic terrorism, if it's serious enough, can be much more dangerous for us than international terrorism in a lot of ways. But we don't designate domestically, number one, because everybody's under American law in the United States. Every state has an anti-terrorism law. The federal government has an array of anti-terrorism laws. So we don't have the same challenge as we do with international organizations in terms of being able to exercise our law on them. And the second thing is we have this legacy of law enforcement and intelligence agencies using their authority to basically spy on people who weren't violating the law and were engaged in constitutionally protected activity. So we don't want to go back there again. So for those two reasons, we don't have a designation process, but I'm here to report to you that when I prosecuted the blind Sheikh, the designation process didn't exist yet. We started in, I think we arrested everyone in 1993. A lot of this happened because of our prosecution and also because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which reached a critical point under the Clinton administration when they were trying to settle it. And out of all that came a number of things. One was the overhaul of counterterrorism law in 1996. The other thing was a process that began to try to safeguard the arrangement that Clinton made that the Israelis would have to deal with Arafat in the negotiations. And one of the reasons that they actually started a designation process was because Hamas was seen as a big rival to Arafat. And they were trying to make it so the idea was Arafat was going to be our guy, right? He was going to be the one to make the peace. So they didn't want him undermined. So a large part of the reason why we started that was to make his life easier. I mean, that wasn't the only reason, but that was a big part of it. And then over time, with the terrorist atrocities of the late 90s, the Al-Qaeda attacks on, the embassies in East Africa, the coal, and ultimately 9/11, that designation process kind of matured into an idea that we could use these tools, mainly Treasury tools and State Department tools, to make it difficult for outside the United States, foreign terrorist organizations to raise money and recruit personnel. So that was what the designation process was all about. And that's really why we don't need a formal legal designation of Antifa in order to treat them as a terrorist organization, which is what they absolutely deserve. When I indicted the Blind Sheikh and those guys, even though we didn't have a designation process, we called them terrorists. We wrote an indictment that called them terrorists. We charged them with conspiring to conduct a terrorist war against the United States. It was not any problem at all to label them what they were or investigate them as what they were. So you don't need to have that to investigate a domestic terrorist group, but you do need to have a commitment that that's how you're going to investigate them.
Right. So if a group is designated as a foreign terrorist organization, what that enables the U.S. to do is prosecute people who, from U.S. soil, give material aid to overseas operatives. We can stop people associated with those foreign terrorist organizations from coming into America. We can sanction their entities, punish governments that sponsor them. It's all overseas action, is what you're saying.
Yep.
Then once we start talking about banning domestic terrorist groups, it kind of doesn't make any sense because they're breaking the law anyway. The law already says you can't be engaging those acts on American soil, and you can't prevent them from coming to America because they're already here. So it's just a different paradigm that you're dealing with.
Right.
One of the ideas that's been thrown out there is Executive Order 13224 that was used by President Bush after 9/11 to basically shut down and freeze the assets of various false charities that were financing Hamas and other Islamic jihadists. And it was basically based on, all right, well, if we have enough evidence to believe that you're contributing to terrorism, then we have the authority to shut you down. Then you can go to court or we'll prosecute you. It's just to stop it right now. And if you look at the executive order on the internet, you'll see that there is a list of Islamic extremist organizations that are on there. So some people look at that and they say, well, why not just add Antifa there? If we were able to designate and sanction the Holy Land Foundation, why couldn't we just add Antifa to the same list that Al-Qaeda and those groups are on, regardless of whether they're foreign or domestic, and then just go after them? So I thought maybe you could address that, because there's some people who I respect that are throwing out this idea of just using Executive Order 13224 in order to accomplish this. And I can kind of see why, based on the really broad language in the executive order.
Yeah, no, it's completely understandable. The thing is, all of those organizations, the 13224 actually talks about international terrorism, foreign terrorism, etc. And the thing is, what you have to always remember when you're dealing with either entities or people who are non-Americans or are essentially non-American, even if they have some Americans who are sort of part of the entity. But if the entity is essentially non-American, it does not have the same array of rights that American citizens have. It doesn't have a presumption that they're conducting themselves in a constitutional manner. They don't have a presumption of innocence under our law. Anything that we enable them to do, including to raise money, is something that's a privilege. It's not a right. And therefore, we have a lot more leeway as far as regulating it is concerned. Whereas with Americans, because they're all imbued with constitutional rights, the line that we draw in the law is crime. So if you're doing something that's illegal, or if you're inciting something that's illegal, there's all kinds of things that we can do to you under the criminal law. But if you're engaged in activity that would be problematic for a foreigner to engage in if he wanted to come to America, but it's First Amendment protected activity, we can't investigate people for that in the United States. Now, once they cross the line and they commit crimes, then we can use their statements, and like with anyone else, we can use the things that they do to try to prove intent in a criminal case, but we can't take action against them unless we reasonably suspect them of committing crime. So the problem with the executive order is it's really designed to crack down on people who don't have the full array of American rights, and trying to apply it to people who are engaged in activity that's protected under American law and who are Americans would be very problematic.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you made it clear that we already have the legal tools in order to go after Antifa or people who aren't Antifa, but say they're anarchists or acting in league with them. It kind of doesn't matter because they're all engaging in conspiracy, racketeering, specific crimes. But at what point, what is the bare minimum that someone would have to do to contribute to the Antifa cause to be investigated or to be prosecuted? So if there's someone out on Facebook who is saying, I love the riots, I love the fact that cops are getting hurt, I'm Antifa, and here's a meme that I posted, but they're not going to meetings. Maybe they're chatting with some people. Is that enough to bring them under investigation? Is it enough to prosecute them? Like where is the point where they just stepped over the line enough that now they're in trouble?
Yeah, see here, I think this brings us back to where we started, because I think that if you're going to build a case like that, again, what you want to start with is, what are they trying to accomplish? So, for example, I think Antifa is engaged in a war against the United States that contemplates the use of force against the United States and against our government. If I'm right about that, and I have, let's say I have two people who they're completely on board with that, that's what they're about, that's what Antifa is about, I can prove on the basis of their statements, I can prove on the basis of the crazy stuff that they do on the street that that's exactly what they're doing. All right, so now I have a conspiracy, right? Now I've got something I can prosecute.
Just because they support that cause now.
Yeah, and also, well, because I can couple their speech with action, or at a minimum, their speech is calling for action. Where it gets to be very hazy is where you're calling for violent action and there's nobody really thinks that anybody would carry it out on the basis of what you say. Those cases are very difficult. Like we convicted the blind Sheikh on a couple of counts of solicitation. One was solicitation of bombings against American military installations, and the other was solicitation to kill Mubarak, who was then the president of Egypt. We didn't have a great challenge convicting him on those because he was notoriously the head of a terrorist organization, and we were able to prove that people did act on his commands. So when he said those things, it wasn't like, me sitting 5 rows behind home plate going, kill the umpire. This was something that was, actually obviously serious that might get carried out. So that's one of the challenges when you're dealing purely with speech and you can't prove that they actually did anything to act on the speech, even to prepare to act on the speech. You have to, incitement is very hard to prove when you don't have somebody who's got a track record of being able to command activity. But once you have a conspiracy, the law says once you can prove a conspiracy, it takes very little evidence to join of activity by someone to try to join themselves to the conspiracy to bring that person in. So once you prove the Antifa conspiracy, if you have speech or activity by people who identify themselves as Antifa and who are urging violent activity against the United States, you have them on the bubble where they could very well be in the conspiracy. When you're making a call about who to charge and who to prosecute, obviously there's what the law requires, which is kind of technical. And then there's the next step, which is recognizing that this is a jury trial. Could we get 12 people to agree beyond a reasonable doubt that this guy's in the conspiracy? And that's what you go through with every single person that you think about charging. And the thing is, Ryan, the more serious the conspiracy, the less demanding a jury is in terms of what kind of evidence you need to show to couple someone with it. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're trying to charge a conspiracy to structure financial transactions to defeat the reporting requirements of the money laundering laws. I barely could get that sentence out to try to remember what it all was. It's a very technical, almost regulatory offense. And most of the time with stuff like that, juries are pretty demanding and the law is pretty demanding in terms of showing that you have a high degree of knowledge that you were violating the law before they will convict you. On the other hand, if you're talking about mass murder attacks, this isn't like George on Seinfeld where they're able to say, gee, was that against the law? Was that wrong? Because if only someone had told me that you can't mass murder people, I would never have gotten involved. Nobody wants to hear that. Everybody knows that if you're talking about violence and you're talking about killing people, you're talking about mass destruction of property, it doesn't lot to convince people that you're involved in that if you are, sort of sticking your toe in the water. We had one guy in our case who his meter was running for about 45 minutes. He showed up right at the last day of the conspiracy. They asked him if he wanted to mix explosives with them. He said, I have to go pray on it. And then he came back and he started, mixing explosives. And the FBI came in about 10 minutes later and he was, he ended up getting a 25-year sentence. And he tried to say, look, I didn't know everything that they were trying to do. And, we were like, you were mixing bombs in a safe house. It doesn't really matter how long you were doing it. That's what you were doing, So if it's serious activity like we're talking about, it doesn't take a lot of proof to bring somebody into a conspiracy.
So why isn't it happening across the country? I mean, and even beyond Antifa, I mean, there's plenty of people we've come across who are advocating illegal activity, sedition against the United States and things like that. So if it's relatively easy to bring a case like that against someone like an Antifa supporter, why does it at least feel like it's not happening on any large scale?
Well, I'd say give it some time. I think it will happen. I didn't mean to suggest by what I said in terms of what proof is required at trial that these are the easiest cases to build. I think that the FBI started investigating. This actually turned out to be kind of scandalous. They started investigating this jihadist group in 1988, and we didn't arrest them until 1993, by which point they had committed one notorious homicide in New York and had bombed the World Trade Center. So there was a lot of activity between 1988 and 1993, but there wasn't enough that people who were trained investigators thought was enough to bring a case. So sometimes, I don't think we'll make that kind of mistake again, but it does take time to pull these cases together. And as you pointed out at the beginning, this is a diffuse group. It's kind of all over the map in time and space. And that makes it a little bit harder, even if you can agree on an ideology, to show that people agreed on specific plots. But I think what has to happen is you have to take one incident, at least, where they do something atrocious, like that attack on Andy, or some of these buildings that they're bombing, and you need to grab a couple of them then, and you build a case that way. And then when some of these kids are being brought in to be processed by their parents. The parents think that they're going out to, hang out with their friends, and it turns out hanging out with your friends means you're, throwing Molotov cocktails through windows and stuff. When you start to bring those people in to question them and they realize that they might be looking at somewhere between like 20, 30, 40 years in jail, they're going to start talking, and they're going to give you, here's the people I know who are involved in it. And you're going to be able to start to map the organization and conduct an investigation that way. These guys, I don't think, Ryan, these guys are going to be like the mafia. They're not going to be like, it's a cost of doing business to be arrested and you never get anything out of them and they won't talk. These guys will sing like birds, but you have to, this goes to what you were talking about before about President Trump's saying that he wants them treated as a terrorist organization. Again, I think the Attorney General's on board with this. You have to decide up front that that's what they are and then treat it that way.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to ask you a question that you're probably anticipating, and I can just hear the audience exploding saying, just ask him this question, even though it's not directly about Antifa. And the question is, when you look at the staffing that the Trump administration has had, and how many were in support of the Muslim Brotherhood being designated as a foreign terrorist organization, it looked like everything had lined up. There were all these press reports about the White House discussions about it. What the heck happened? How come that hasn't happened? Do you have any insight for us?
Yeah, I think I do, because I came smack up against this as late as today when I was starting to pull my column together for the weekend. I noticed that Tom Tillis a senator from North Carolina, wants, on the basis of the story that's out there about the Russians giving bounty payments to the Taliban to go after our soldiers in Afghanistan. Tillis wants to have legislation that labels Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And when I read that, my first reaction is, well, that'll be a cute trick, because we've had 3 administrations in a row that don't want to label the Taliban as a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
So how are you going to get Russia for promoting terrorism when we can't even get the Taliban labeled? And I think, Ryan, a lot of the problem practically that we ran into with the Muslim Brotherhood, aside from the fact that, people want to live on this fantasy that they don't really do violence, they're just the intellectual guys in the movement, they're not really violent terrorists. But the other practical problem you have is the administrations of the last 3 administrations of both parties have wanted to negotiate with the Taliban because they think that's the only way we'll get ourselves out of the mess we're in Afghanistan. And as a result, even though the Taliban are 5 alarm terrorists who are happy to tell you that they want to mass murder Americans, our government won't designate them as terrorists because they want to negotiate with them, and they don't want to run flush into our policy against negotiating with terrorists. So they figure,
is that
well,
what
if we
you
don't
think
call
the Trump
them terrorists,
administration wants, though? You think they want to negotiate with the Muslim Brotherhood? Or, I mean, maybe it could be Erdogan's influence, because we know Erdogan does call the White House and complain about things, calls Trump personally, and we don't know the content of those conversations, but there is that line. So do you think it might be more about that, the influence of Erdogan, which, he's had a lot of influence on all the administrations?
Yeah, I don't think there's one silver bullet answer to it. I think that's a part of it. Erdogan is very good at playing our administrations. He's done it time and time again, and he's made it clear, or at least made it a strong suggestion, that our continued presence in Turkey, where we have very important military assets, hinges on his continued cooperation and our solicitude toward some of his ideas, which include that Hamas and Hezbollah are not terrorist organizations, right? They're just domestic political movements with guns. So that's part of it, clearly. You also have as you know, a whole movement that's been constructed in the United States and built up on the basis of a lot of funding that got poured into it, which has cultivated relationships between the American branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, because there's not just one, as we know, there's a number of them, and both academic institutions and our government. And they want to take the position that these are just, they don't even want to call them Islamists. They basically say that these are just like moderate Muslims. So to designate the Muslim Brotherhood would definitely get in their grill. And then you have people who come back and say, well, just like they say without Antifa, well, what is the Muslim Brotherhood anyway? Because the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is different from the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia, is different from the Muslim Brotherhood in Philadelphia. And, it's not really one big old thing. But I really think the biggest problem we have here, and this is with a lot of this stuff, is the Taliban. The fact that they won't even designate the Taliban because they want to negotiate with the Taliban. They think that once you label someone a terrorist, then there's all kinds of political fallout, because eventually you'll want to deal with these people and negotiate with them, and you'll be accused of negotiating with terrorists. So it's one thing if it's Al Qaeda and they're, actively bombing us and doing the kind of stuff that Al Qaeda does. It's quite another thing if you're dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood and they have a significant presence in our country, and they've cultivated a lot of political goodwill on the left.
All right. Well, thanks so much for giving us so much of your time, Andy. I really appreciate it. Do you have any last minute plugs before we go?
Well, the book is called Ball of Collusion. Don't ask me about a sequel because I have to come up with another Temptation song, and I haven't been able to do that yet. But it's no, that's all I have. You can find me if you like, mostly on National Review, but I write here, there, and everywhere. And I just want to say I'm a big admirer of yours and
Thank
a
you.
big admirer of the Clarion Project. I think you do critical work. And I really think, especially if we're going to have, with this Biden-Trump contest, we may actually get back to something we haven't had in a while, which is a discussion about terrorism. And not only the domestic terrorism that we're dealing with, but what it would be like, what would be the differences if the current administration is gone and the new administration comes in, and we get back to the Obama-Biden approach to counterterrorism, which was very different from the Bush-Cheney approach to counterterrorism. So I think we ought to sort of dust those binders off because we're going to be at it again.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. And I also want to thank our partners at CELL, C-E-L-L, the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, for making this possible. And again, thank you to Mr. Larry Mizell for his support in making this event happen. And just one last message to everyone before we go. Make sure you celebrate the 4th of July if you're an American. And here's why. And it goes to some advice that you gave me, Andy, many years ago. You probably don't even remember. I ran into you in the green room at Fox News Channel, and we were just talking about some of the annoying things that happen in our field. And you're making some sort of joke. And I think it was just a little bit of dark humor. And I remember as we were laughing, we got done laughing, and then you turned to me, and at first I thought you were joking. You're like, you know, it's really important to have a good, dark sense of humor about this. Otherwise, you'll lose your mind. And I kind of chuckled, like thinking that was a joke. You wait for me to get done chuckling, and then you look at me again and go, no, really, you'll lose your mind if you don't have a good sense of humor. So make sure everyone out there, I know this is a very heavy topic. You owe it to yourself. And because we need you in good working order, all of us need you to go out and celebrate the 4th of July. Take a break from the very negative and overwhelming news cycle and recharge your batteries. Thanks so much for watching. Everyone, make sure you subscribe to the Clarion Project newsletter so that we can alert you to future webinars. And we hope to hear from you and talk with you soon. And thank you again. Yes.